Hello, coders. Good afternoon. It's episode 116. Today we're going to be talking about development environments and what they are compared to things like testing environments and production environments. Now, I've just noticed the stream bitrate is dropping, but we're going to continue on because I'm recording this as we go, and this will be used, obviously, for the audio version of this podcast. If you haven't done so already, please do check out the How to Code Well podcast on Spotify and iTunes and all that other podcast players and all that jazz. So I'm going to continue on. I do apologize to the chat if anyone is seeing any stuttering or anything. I don't know what's going on with the bitrate here. Okay, so development environments. What are they? Everybody in software development has a development environment. And I suppose before we get into the weeds of what are the tools involved in creating a development environment, I suppose we need to define what is the environment compared to other environments. And I liken a development environment to, say, a scientist's laboratory, right? So a scientist's lab, when they're creating some innovation, some invention, the COVID-19 vaccine, for instance, they do this in a lab, right? They build this in a lab, and it goes through some form of procedure and process and experimentation before they actually come up with the end product. Now, that lab is full of various different tools, such as microscopes, lots of weird and wonderful medical tools, or if you're in a garage, it could be full of loads of screwdrivers and Allen keys and hex keys and all sorts of different machinery and stuff to do the thing, to build the thing that goes off to the production line. So again, you could see this in, say, a production line of a car manufacturer. So if you're manufacturing cars, the end product is the car, but you obviously need to have an environment in order to build that car or those cars, i.e. the production environment. It would go through a series of processes and procedures in order to construct the parts for that car, which then build up the full product that then goes off to the public. You don't just go to the public and say, "Oh, you want this car?" Then you're going to have to. These are all the nuts and bolts that you have to screw together. You don't go to the public and say, "Oh, you want to see this website?" Well, before you do, you need to compile all this code and actually build the web server. And before you even click on a page, you have to build the thing yourself. The build process is the environment. It is the development environment. So, like I said, I liken this to labs or construction and engineering sort of environments that build the thing that the end user, the client, ends up with. And these environments, as I mentioned, they have sophisticated tools for things like testing. So the actual, the process, once you've built the thing, you then need to test the thing to make sure it actually meets a standard for it to go out, a production ready, as we mentioned in the last podcast. So in the last podcast, we mentioned production ready, and I talked about what that means. So I suppose in this podcast, we're flipping on its head and talking about from the development perspective. And everyone's development environment is going to be very different from everybody else's. Everybody's garage is very different from everybody else's, or construction yard is different from everybody else's. Certain engineers prefer certain different tools, and I am lumping software developers in engineers. We are engineers after all. And we have a huge amount of tools at our disposal. Some are free, some are paid for, and that builds the environment that we are using to construct the thing that we are going to give to our end client. Now, I've been a software developer for about 20 years, 2 decades, and I guess for the last, say, 6 years, I've been a contractor. And in those years, every project has had a different environment, a different environment for me to use, or my own environment, a local environment. And we'll get on to the three different types of development environments in just a second. But what I'm trying to say is that just because you've done one project doesn't mean that the next project is going to be exactly the same in terms of your setup, in terms of your tools. These tools, these build tools, these tools that help you build and develop and debug, they change and evolve over time. Some of them get better, some of them get worse, some of them become paid for services, some of them don't. So they evolve and change, and you shouldn't just stick to one set of tools. Don't get too comfortable in those tools. Don't be afraid of changing those tools. If those tools that you change to can make yourself more efficient as developing the thing, then go on and change. Don't be afraid to change the tools, just because you're comfortable in the tools that you use. So the development environment is also an area for us to do research and development, so R&D. So we are basically throwing code together to see what sticks. We're testing things out. We're trialing different things. This is as far away from production ready as it possibly can be. So we literally start with just a blank sheet of paper, or in the digital sense, it's just a ticket. And that has, build this feature. These are the subtasks of that feature. And then you go away and you try and develop that feature, and you try different things out. And you do so in a very iterative way. If you follow the sort of an XP sort of way, an extreme programmers kind of way, or perhaps you're test heavy, you will probably be doing TDD, so test-driven development. So you'll be writing the tests first, then building the code, then ensuring the code matches and makes. You'll be making sure that those tests are then verifying that the thing that you've built actually does the thing that it needs to do, and then you would basically do that on a rinse and repeat and refactor cycle. So yeah, I've kind of moved away from my notes a bit, but basically the environment is this journey from building nothing or having nothing, just a specification. So you start with absolutely zero code, or you start with a code base that you're going to build upon, and then you create a and this is going into the tooling, which I'll delve into more in a minute, but you will create perhaps a feature branch in Git, and that feature branch is your isolated, siloed environment, your place, not your environment, your basically your code space in which you can then write code, cut code, and then once you deem that code acceptable and tested, then you would commit that back into perhaps a staging branch, which then later on gets committed back into the main branch, the master branch. And that's how you would roll it. You would have a feature, you would build the feature out, test the feature, and then commit that back into the main sort of timeline, if you will. So the histories then get merged, and then that gets pushed off to wherever it needs to go, staging, production, and so on and so forth. And this journey has all sorts of different components in it. So formatting, designing, building, and these have a design system in place that says, these colors, these are the brand colors, these are the brand fonts. This is how the grid system is used. This is how the buttons should look like. All of those kind of components would be built up and defined in that well-scoped sort of area. Excuse me. And also, you would have in your testing space, you would have perhaps CI, which is continual integration. So you'll be integrating it into something, and that pipeline will be doing some code checking, making sure that the code matches a given format, make sure that the code is up to standard, up to scratch. It might be checking some static analysis. and all of that jazz, checking for, say, security risks, then running through maybe unit tests and integration tests and acceptance tests and whatnot before it actually gets to the point where you've got a green light and then you can put it back into the main history. So, as you can imagine, the development environment is incredibly resource hungry because there's all of these additional things that need to happen outside of just building the code. So, all of these auditing tools, all these reporting tools, all of these things, these cogs in the wheel that audit and verify your own code. There's also the fact that when you're developing, when you're in the development environment, your environment often mimics from a very basic point of view what production should look like. So, for example, if you've got a database, say MySQL, or if you've got, say, Elasticsearch, maybe you've got some Redis, some caching, maybe you've got some RabbitMQ stuff going on, you would have all of those components in your development environment set to, say, development mode, maybe. And so now you can see that your development environment kind of mimics the infrastructure in a very loose sense to what is actually going to be pushed out to production. Otherwise, how can you develop something when you can't develop, when you don't have a very similar working environment to what will actually be used? So this means that your development environment needs to be really, really good, as in incredibly good with hardware. It needs to be as good as it possibly can do, because you don't want to be hitting any bottlenecks. You're essentially creating a mini environment, a mini world that replicates what perhaps production kind of looks like. And you're testing and writing code against it, refreshing the page, running scripts, doing all sorts of different things, throwing things at it, testing it, hammering it, trying different user journeys out and all of that stuff. You don't want your hardware being the bottleneck at all. And so this is why I go back to saying, like, I will never buy a laptop again that only has 16 gigabytes of RAM, because that is just impossible for me to work on. It needs to be at least 32, coming up to 64. That's why I haven't pushed the button on the new Apple M1s, because you just can't get anything above 16 gigs. And in my opinion, that's not, well, I certainly can't use it. I was going to say that's not professional, but you can build applications with less RAM, sure, but when you start working on resource hungry environments, then you really need to start having a laptop or a development environment that packs a punch. Also, and we are sort of dripping down into the tooling, and we'll get more into specifics in a minute. Also, a lot of these development environments rely on virtualized environments in order for you to do your work. Now, before we move into that even further, let me just say that there's 3 different types of development environments, okay? And you can actually intermingle these. And I've used all of these three before in various different projects. The first one is the obvious one, and that is that it is your machine, and it's local to you, as in you pull the code down to your local machine. You are perhaps running Docker containers on your machine. You are running tests on your machine on the code that you write on your machine. It is all on your machine. The second one is where you've got, they're kind of like virtualized environments. So these are environments that you connect to and then work on remotely. So, for instance, it could be a virtualized environment somewhere that you connect to via a VPN. And that environment would be set up to replicate some other environment that something is being used. Maybe it's kind of closer to production than what you can do on your local machine. And this is done for various different reasons. So, for instance, if you're working on it for a company and they prefer to have all of their tools under their own belt, and they prefer that all of their developers are using the same tools, then having this sort of remote access is quite useful, because then they control what the developers can actually install and use. So, for instance, if you needed to install some software, then you would have to request that software to be installed in your virtualized environment that you log into. Now, you could log into that virtualized environment using something like SSH, or like just a remote desktop or something like that. So I've played with that before. It's okay, it's there is an extra level of friction, because, like I said, you have to then request the things that get installed on your virtualized environment, and also you're not actually in control of the virtualized environment. That virtualized environment is owned by the company, and therefore it's not as easy for you to just tinker with it, if that makes sense. The ones that I've used that are very good are the ones that can be torn away, scrapped, and then replaced very, very quickly. So if you screw up your virtual environment, you just request it to be rebuilt, and it just gets rebuilt from the fly. And that's really, really good, because, like I said, you want to reduce the amount of friction that the developer has to actually develop the tools. So the last one, the third one, is more of a cloud-based kind of interface. So this is where you're using tools that are actually on the web, and this is becoming more of a trend now, where you've got, say, VS Code that you can run in the browser, or you've got code. I think it's code. Is it Code Spaces from GitHub, where you can actually build a development environment in the cloud and then allow people access to it, but through perhaps a browser interface. So. And you can mix all of these up together. You can mix these together if you want. So another example of using cloud-based stuff is like peer programming. So if you're a remote dev like I am, and you're peer programming with someone else, then you would share the screen, right? You would share your screen, and you would and there are tools, especially, I know that there's one I've used it before in PHP Storm, and there is another one, I'm sure, for VS Code. I'm not a VS Code user, but I'm sure there's one here where you can actually do a peer programming session with another programmer, and you can share the same code base, and they can play with it. You can play with it almost as though they are sat right next to you. So and there's various other third-party tools and stuff that you can use for that too. That's more of a sort of an example of the cloud-based environment setup. So, for example, I don't necessarily need to have the code base checked out. I could just share someone else's screen and then jump on their stuff. They all have pros and cons, right? They all have pros and cons, because the local one, the traditional one where you have a local machine, it's your responsibility, and it's expensive. As a contractor, you obviously need to have, as a self-employed developer, I need to have the tools in order to do the work, right? And this does fall into the whole costing thing, right? So I personally believe that, and this is just my opinion, that if you go out and buy a development machine, regardless of whether you're a contractor or whatnot, but it's more important when you're a contractor, I think, spend as much money as you possibly feasibly can on the hardware, and don't scrimp on things like RAM or disk space, right? Even, don't go, I'll never use a terabyte, so I'll get 512 gigs, or 32 gigs is to afford it. If you can afford it, get as much as you possibly can for your buck. And you want to focus, in my opinion, on RAM, and then CPU, and then hard drive space. And the reason why I do it in that order is that hard drive space, if you run out of hard drive space, just bung it on an external drive. Bung all the things that you don't need on an external drive. I've done that before, just to give you enough space. And also, something that is extremely important when you're a contractor is when you have your own local development environment, have that separate to whatever you do as a side project. So whatever, the how to code well stuff, I try and keep that as separate as possible. I'm talking now on my Mac Mini, which is not anything to do with the client stuff, right? Because that's just not on during the day. And then the laptop here has most of the client work on it, and that I try and keep that separation as much as possible, just because of say storage space or anything else. If a client wants me to install something, then I have to say yes, of course I will. And it's a working machine. It's a machine for a professional piece of work, right? This is sort of a different headspace to being a hobbyist web developer to being a professional web developer, someone who gets paid, an hourly rate or a daily rate to do something, compared to someone who's just building something on the side because they think it's fun and they're interested in it. There's obviously, that's all well and good, and everybody starts like that, fine. But once you start really getting paid for it, then you really need to make that sort of, okay, no, enough's enough now. Let's buy a dedicated machine for our local environment. And the thing is, you don't know what your client is going to require until they require it. So I've been in conversation where people will say, this is hundreds of gigabytes that you need to pull down. You need to run this script overnight. And that conversation's made at like 4:30 in the evening, and every shop is going to shut. If you don't have that space, you don't have that space. So you want to have disk space and RAM in abundance. In abundance. And what I like to do is refresh my local environments probably once every 3 to 4 years. And I try and spec them out as like I said, as best as I possibly can when that happens. And you shouldn't really be worried about, if you're being paid well for what you do, try not to worry too much about the cost, because if you're being paid well for what you do, then that's the tool. That's the tool. Try and work out how much your tools are per day based on what you are. You'll be shocked. What you get, you'll be shocked. Okay, so let's talk about the tooling that's in the development environment. What actually are the things in the environment? So the first one is an obvious one, and that's, or it might not be an obvious one. It is an IDE. Okay, so this is an integrated development environment. Now this, you don't have to have this when you're starting out. When you're starting out, you don't have to have an IDE, although I personally suggest you do, because it does give you a lot of sugar that you can, some sweetener on your code. So it has things like autocomplete. It has connections to, say, databases. It's got debugging tools. It's got all sorts of like source control stuff. It's got all sorts of good stuff that every developer will eventually need. Also, you've got terminals. All right, so I know that, I'm a Mac guy, I'm a Linux guy. I don't know what it's like in the Windows world at the moment. But because thankfully I'm no longer a Windows dev. Woo! But you've got things like the Windows shell, and with Mac you've obviously got terminal. I use iterm personally, and then Linux you obviously have the bash shell. Okay, so then you've got source control. As I mentioned earlier, you have your feature branches and your main branch, your master branch, and then you've got your fix branches and release branches and all of that stuff. That's all done in source control, so things like Git. And then you've got, say, your database stuff. So you've got a SQL editor. I personally prefer to do all my SQL in the command line, but that's because I'm an old Git. I'm an old guy. But you could use, say, PHP, what's the one? What's PHP MyAdmin, or there is SQL Pro or whatever. Then you've got your API stuff, so Swagger, you've got Postman or Postwoman, and then you've got your actual environments on top of your development environment. So you've got your Docker containers, right? So you've got Docker. Or you might be using a LAMP stack, a WAMP stack, a MAMP stack if you're a PHP developer. And then, of course, we haven't even spoken about the actual programming language, right? So you have the language in which you're using. And so I'm a PHP developer, for instance, and a JavaScript developer, and a Python developer. So I have all of those languages installed, plus all of the versions of those languages installed in different various containers and stuff. And I've got their various different IDEs set up. So you've got PHP Storm. You could use VS Code. I've got PyCharm for Python. I've also got WebStorm for a bit of JavaScript. So basically, you need to have enough memory and storage for all of this stuff. Don't just think, oh, I'm just going to use one IDE and one terminal with one text editor and one Docker container. No, that's not going to happen. You need, on an average day, I've perhaps got one IDE running, probably 6 to 8 different terminals running. Several different Docker containers going. My RAM at the moment Docker is consuming about 13 gigabytes of RAM, and I am in the position where there are things slowing down because of it. So I'm in the current market for an upgrade, and I'm holding out for whether or not Mac decides to bring out a 32, 6 or 64 gigabyte. Whatever it is going to be, and when that happens, I will certainly drop the bomb on that and pick that up. If that doesn't happen, or if it's incredibly expensive, then I'll have to turn to System 76 or some other Linux sort of setup to actually just get the requirements and the resources that I need. But on that point, you want to be trying to keep your development environment as similar as the other members on your team. And this can veer off a little bit when you're a remote dev like myself. So what I tend to do is when I start a project and when I have been given free rein over what tooling I use, I often try and ask what tooling everybody else uses within the team and try and keep it as similar as possible. It just avoids friction when you're trying to set something up and you have to do it differently to someone else, and you end up asking a question that nobody can answer because you're using a tool that nobody has used to do the same thing that they've done in a different tool. So I would prefer to keep my tools as similar to everybody else's as possible, even if that means sometimes that the tools that I use are actually a pain in the ass. But I do so because I can get help very, very quickly. And you don't want to be what I'm trying to say here is you don't want to be a lone wolf. You don't want to, so if the majority of the team are using Mac, then get a Mac. If the majority of the team is using Windows, then use a Windows box. All of that good jazz. So we've spoken about what a local environment is, what a hosted environment is, and what a cloud-based environment is. And as I mentioned, you can use those. You can mix and match if you want on those. We've spoken about the loosely costings of these things. Try and spend as much as you possibly can, as comfortably as you can on these things. And as I said, I try and refresh every 3 to 4 years. And what I don't want to do is say, spend a huge amount of money on something and then find out in 2 years' time that it is super, super sluggish and slow. So that's why I try and go for as much as I possibly can at the time, and drop that. So RAM, CPU, and then storage, as I've mentioned here. So lots of RAM, lots of CPU, and lots of storage space if possible. If you're a Windows guy or girl and you're thinking and you're tempted to going for a Mac, yeah, the screen's great. You've got Retina displays and all that jazz. Yeah, they're better than Windows boxes, but if you have to make a compromise between a display and RAM or CPU or storage space, don't. Because all we're doing, if you're a back-end developer, then what you're mostly doing is just typing, as in text. So it doesn't really matter if the shades are slightly different on the colors of the website. It's less important to a back-end developer than it is on a front-end developer who actually, is working very closely with the designer and the CSS and all of that stuff. If you're purely back-end, then don't make the compromise just to get a better screen. If you're having to weigh up whether to go with RAM or whether to get a Retina display, see that as a benefit if an unexpected benefit if you can. The thing is, these Macs they are good, but there's a lot about them that you don't necessarily need. And anyway, what I usually do is I plug my laptop into this huge screen that I've got here. So, the ratio's all gone anyway. The resolution's very, very different. So we talked about the differences between the development environment and, say, production. We mentioned that you want to try and keep it as close as possible, but obviously you're in development mode. This means that you're going to be doing things with caching turned off, with various different things, debugging tools turned on. Okay, so as you may have seen when I've done my live stream, my live coding on things like the e-commerce shopping cart that we're building at the moment, Silas, using Symfony, that's all in development mode, and that's incredibly, incredibly slow. But as soon as I put it into production mode, it's incredibly fast, and that's because of the caching and all of that other things that get turned on when you get into production mode. And it's the same for front-end devs as well. They have a different setup from development and production. In production, a lot of their code is minified, uglified, and compressed, whereas in development, it's not. Obviously, and therefore their file sizes are much bigger. Their request HTTP requests are huge compared to what it is on production, and therefore they need to have the resource to allow them to do that and manipulate things on the fly. So yeah. I hope I haven't missed anything out, but if I have done, please do let me know. Jump on Twitter at howtocodewell. Also, if you haven't done so already, please do check out our Discord server. It's howtocodewell.net/Discord. It's totally free to join. There is sections in there for, say, coding help and project feedback. I've also got a bunch of channels in there for things like, the notifying when these live streams are going on and other bits and pieces like that too. We've recently had a spammer, and I just want to say a massive thank you to the community for pointing that out. And that's been completely banned. That spammer has been totally banned. So it's a nice community to check out. If you're new to programming, then do join, because there's a lot of people there that can give you help and advice. And also, if you have a suggestion for upcoming videos, podcasts, tutorials, courses that I do on How to Code Well, then there is a suggestions channel on Discord too. Anyway, thank you ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everybody, and I hope the bitrate hasn't been too bad today. I'm obviously recording this as well as streaming this, so I'll be using the recording, not the stream version, to do the podcast, which goes out every Friday. Thank you very much. Happy coding, everybody. I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.